Okay, now on to Article 1, Section 5. Each House shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, but a small number may adjourn from day to day, and may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members in such manner and under such penalties as each House may provide. Each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of two-thirds, expel a member. Each House shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same, except such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. And the yeas and nays of the members of either House on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. Neither House, during the session of Congress, shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the two Houses shall be sitting. So, following the establishment of a Congress, the sections of the Constitution distinguish many of the duties and responsibilities of that establishment. The Congress results largely from a great compromise during the Constitutional Convention. Section 5 grants the House of Representatives and the Senate the ability of self-governance. There are 4 different clauses in Section 5 that grant and structure legislative procedures. The first of these clauses allows Congress to judge the elections of its own members. This comes into practice in the modern day when the outcomes of state elections are exceptionally debatable and Congress can be petitioned to overturn elections. Judicial review is not able to be provided in this circumstance. At times, states have been required by Congress to have a completely new election take place. Although able to distinguish winners of hotly contested elections, Congress may not disallow duly elected officials membership in their respective chambers as long as qualifications have been met. The Supreme Court has held that elected officials cannot be barred from entry to Congress based upon pre-election etiquette. In the same clause, it reads, a majority of each House shall constitute a quorum to do business. At any time, a member of either chamber may request a quorum. This is similar to taking attendance. Legally, business cannot be undertaken during the meetings of either chamber without a quorum, but the Supreme Court has decided that it is up to the discretion of the chambers to determine whether a quorum is present automatically when a bill is passed. A second clause in Article 1, Section 5 requires Congress to determine its own rules of its proceedings, which leads to influence on significant legislative results. An example of this can be seen with the House Rules Committee, which decides which amendments are presented with a bill, severely altering the topic of debate and voting. The Senate has a related procedure when the majority leader exerts significant influence on the agenda of that chamber. Invoking cloture is another example of Senate procedure that is determined amongst itself. The second clause also grants members of Congress the ability to punish its members for disorderly behavior and with the concurrence of two-thirds expel a member. 5 House of Representative members and 20 senators have been expelled from Congress throughout United States history. The third clause requires each House to maintain a journal of procedures and proceedings. This journal must be published in a timely manner and is today published regularly via the Internet. Transparency in the United States government system is tantamount to maintaining a strong democracy. Although the clause admits that secrets must be kept, in some instances this is increasingly rare. Other public access instruments and reports by committees are included in the publication of the congressional journals. A roll call vote may be requested at any time in any chamber as part of this clause as well. This requires a 1/5 vote, and there are different procedures for such in each chamber of Congress. This often helps to establish a sense of accountability. Lastly, the fourth clause of Article 1, Section 5 details how neither chamber of Congress may depart or adjourn for longer than 3 days and not to another location. There is, of course, a potential for an absence of one chamber thwarting the political efforts of another, and the founders identified this. Usually the chambers of Congress agree on the time and place of adjournment, and a resolution is passed permitting such. It is the prerogative, as stated by the Supreme Court of Congress, to decide when it is in considered recess. Although not every procedure of the Congress is present in Section 5 of Article 1, this section does nonetheless a good job of providing an outline of congressional proceedings. Article 1, Section 6. Okay, now on to Article 1, Section 6. The senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be ascertained by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. They shall in all cases, except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses, and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house they shall not be questioned in any other place. No senator or representative shall, during the time for which he was elected, be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States, which shall have been created, or the emoluments whereof shall have been increased during such time, and no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. The Constitution prescribes in its text that Congresspeople must be paid by the United States federal government out of Treasury funds rather than by states themselves. This is a reinforcement that Congresspeople are federal officials and not state officials. Article 1, Section 6 also maintains that members of the House of Representatives and members of the Senate cannot be questioned by the President or by the court system for any conduct on the chamber floors, such as speeches given or debates made. It also states that representatives and senators cannot be compelled to official positions wherein the salary for which had been increased during their service in the Senate or House of Representatives. This is called the ineligibility clause and is an ethical containment for Congress in that they cannot solicit higher wages in this unsavory way. One issue accompanied by the ineligibility clause is whether a Congress member may position themselves into an office if the salary for which has been reduced to its original amount after its raising. This has been the circumstance in a multitude of situations throughout United States history. Lastly, but very much not least, included in Article 1, Section 6 is the clause, no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during his continuance in office. This prevents Congresspeople from holding multiple positions within the United States government, an example being that a senator could not serve in the president's cabinet. This clause is considered the incompatibility clause, and it is extremely important in maintaining a sufficient separation of powers. There is also a separation of personnel included. One who holds a position in Congress cannot hold office at one moment in either the executive or judicial branches. There have been questions raised regarding the incompatibility clause that do not deserve much attention, such as whether the president is considered an office of the United States or not. This ambiguity is exaggerated at best. Originally, the incompatibility clause was simply for ethical purposes, but it has evolved from the founding fathers' intentions to a legal text that has helped sustain a strong separation of powers in the United States government structure. An interesting empowerment is that of the president, who does not feel compelled to make compulsory appointments to his cabinet from Congress members. And another interesting note to consider is that there is no incompatibility clause presented by the Constitution for members of the other two branches, executive and judicial, though the American Bar Association strongly discourages such multi-branch intertwining. In addition, federal and state governments intertwining in this manner, although frowned upon, is considered allowable pursuant to the Constitution. The consequence-inducing clause of incompatibility is the primary reason that the United States government has not degenerated into a parliamentary-focused institution. Also, the committee-making procedures of Congress are largely a result of this clause. Article 1, Section 7 reads, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it is becomes law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approves, he shall sign it, but if he shall return it with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceed to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of the House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent together with the objections to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered, and if approved by 2/3 of that House, it shall become a law. But in all such cases, the votes of both Houses shall be determined by yeas and nays, and the names of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered on the journal of each House respectively. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law, in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. Every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and House of Representatives may be necessary, except on a question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States, and before the same shall take effect, shall be approved by him, or being disapproved by him, shall be repassed by 2/3 of the Senate and House of Representatives, according to the rules and limitations described in the case of a bill. Okay. So Article 1, Section 7. There are certain regulations and requirements concerning how legislation is produced by Congress, and the clauses of Section 7 pertain to this. The first clause of Section 7 in Article 1 is the origination clause, whose meaning comes from Old English law. This designates the power of the purse to the House of Representatives. the chamber of which is most aligned with the will of the people. This causes all legislation regarding the funding of the government to originate in the House of Representatives, though the Senate may amend such legislation. The origination clause is derived from the Great Compromise of the Constitutional Convention. This designation of power is in response to the disproportionate power of the Senate in regard to state influence. Hence, the budget of the government is largely influenced by larger states and their respective representatives in the House. Although many founding fathers were hesitant about giving such a grand ability to that of the House of Representatives and not the Senate, it is mostly irrelevant, as the Senate is empowered to alter such bills before passing them. The next clause is that of the presentment clause, which can be seen to be much more relevant. This contains the substantial requirement that a bill presented to the President before it is ratified. The President must provide reasoning if he or she chooses to reject a bill and send it back to Congress for reconsideration. This is a veto. Of course, as previously discussed, there are also pocket vetoes. We're going to change directions here. Okay, of course, as previously discussed, there are also pocket vetoes and procedures in either case of a traditional veto or that of a pocket veto that must be followed. There is, however, controversy regarding what exactly adjournment means and when it is instituted. The Supreme Court has basically decided that if Congress adjourns in a way that prevents the President from returning rejected legislation, it is decidedly adjourned. In contrast, an adjournment of one chamber for 3 days does not distinguish Congress to be adjourned, and a pocket veto is disallowed in this scenario. In further contrast, Congress may allow for a clerk or other official to maintain the acceptance of a veto in the absence of Congress members. Lastly, the presentment of resolutions clause is related to the pursuance of legislation in primary form. This clause makes it so that a bill must be presented to the President regardless of the name or description that the legislation takes on, whether a bill, resolution, or other such denomination. This clause, though, does not require issues of adjournment to be presented to the President and explicitly disregards such. Resolutions that do not specifically enact legislation may also be disregarded from this clause, as well as subpoenas and summons. In an important Supreme Court case, it was ruled that a legislative veto by resolution in regard to executive action was not permitted. Many important issues have been raised regarding judicial review of clauses found in Article 1, Section 7. Rarely do constitutional procedural processes for making legislation require enforcement by the judiciary. Regulations regarding presentment and generally bicameralism are structured into the national government in a non-circumventable way. However, complete acceptance and utilization of the clauses presented by Section 7 have at times come into question. In this scenario, the Supreme Court must interpret the decidedly difficult issue of the enforcement of ambiguous constitutional constructs. A powerful example of this can be seen from the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, which saw its origination in the House of Representatives under the guise of a revenue-raising bill. Absolutely nothing of the originating bill, which related to finance and taxes, was spared in its eventual passing. This was considered a shell bill, and proponents arguing against it stated that it violated the originations clause. It was asked that the bill be struck down in its entirety. The Supreme Court decided historically it was not paramount to disallow the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. As such, shell bills had been used and approved by the Senate before, if not relatively frequently. The great equilibrium and give and take that results from bicameralism was not thus upended. It can be argued that the origination clause has been irrelevant and even unusable in modern times, especially since senators and representatives of the House are both uniformly elected by the people directly. There are many who would use constitutional litigation as a weapon to undo the tedious work that is involved in constitutional interpretation, as is the case with the Affordable Care Act example. There are some other complications, although rare in circumstances, relating to Section 7 that require Supreme Court intervention. Another name for Article 1, Section 7, Clause 3 is the Order, Resolution, and Vote Clause, and this clause has come under some dispute recently regarding its interpretation. Previously, it was decided that this clause's primary purpose was to prohibit the guides of legislation having alternative titles in order to prevent required authorization and approval by the President. There is a lack of sufficient proof of intention by the Founding Fathers regarding the Order, Resolution, and Vote Clause, but James Madison's intent is the primary source of interpretation, and according to recent research, it is unaligned with the text of the Constitution. The idea presented is that the Presentment Resolutions Clause or Order, Resolution, and Vote Clause grants additional powers to single-chamber legislation than circumventing many aspects of bicameralism. This is thus elaborated further with the requirement and presentments must be made to the President only if it is authorized by a prior statute, and since amendments are not subject to such, presentment is not required in such a case. This can go even beyond and be directly related to Congress's ability to delegate power, as previously discussed. Arguing against this generally, however, strongly disagrees. Arguments against this strongly disagree and says the order, resolution, and vote clause is limited in its disregarding to dissemination of subpoenas. This can be examined under the idea that Congress may not delegate legislative power even to itself. There are, furthermore, issues that arise regarding the necessary and proper clause of Section 8 and its coinciding with the issuance of subpoenas. Article 1, Section 8, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties imposed on excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes, to establish an uniform rule of naturalization and uniform law on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States, to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and correct coin of the United States, to establish post offices and post roads, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulations of the land naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers, and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Okay, so my interpretation, or the interpretation of that is throughout the history of the United States, ever since the founding fathers, federalism has swayed back and forth. There are 4 different periods where federalism underwent the most serious of changes. However, these include after the founding, after the Civil War, after the New Deal, and after the Rehnquist Supreme Court. The first of such federalisms is the enumerated powers federalism. Federalism was vastly improved relative to the Articles of Confederation after the ratification of the Constitution. The Founding Fathers largely empowered the national government and provided a direct route to helping citizens and therefore circumvented state governments. However, it was still critical to maintain states' rights and sovereignty. Interstate commerce was included to be regulated by the states under the Constitution, and the Constitution refrained from enumerating state legislative powers. The national government was constructed so that it would only have limited and enumerated powers and abilities as outlined in the Constitution. Entities, procedures, and processes not prescribed by the Constitution were largely left to the discretion of the states, thereby allowing a degree of self-governance. After the Civil War, the notion of federalism morphed drastically again into something that could be considered fundamental rights federalism. This relates particularly to civil rights, which were both governed and denied following the Civil War to the black population formerly enslaved. The Civil Rights Act was enacted and an amendment to the Constitution was made, which substantially helped to protect minorities in the United States. The amendments and therefore civil rights were added to the Constitution after the Civil War in concurrence with those enacted during the Reconstruction period so as to distinguish fundamental rights federalism. Unfortunately, there was a period where the Supreme Court dismantled and dismissed many of these civil rights protections until the next period of federalism. The next federalism is considered New Deal federalism and begins as a result of the New Deal. Regulatory power by the federal government was expanded upon, and the state sovereignty related federalism prescribed by the Founding Fathers was largely left for naught. Economic activity between the states was widely modified by the federal government, and the regulation of such ensued, leaving interstate commerce under a federal capacity of control. Following this New Deal federalism comes state sovereignty federalism, which could also be considered Justice Rehnquist federalism or New Federalism. States became more intimately protected than other private entities, and immunizing capabilities were presented to the states in order to maintain a sense of sovereignty. The Rehnquist court pushed for non-economic regulations to be left wholly to the states themselves, but left interstate commerce to be maintained federally. Since the Rehnquist Court, an idea of denouncing and pushing back against New Deal federalism has persisted, and state sovereignty is very much made a priority. The autonomy of the states as individual entities is so preserved. Federalism is arguably more advantageous to the prosperity of the United States than in state sovereignty. The United States legislature has deferred to the notion that federalism is only more critical when votes are needed. This is a farce, to say the least. There are a multitude of reasons why federalism is extremely important. The first of such is that federalism leaves most legal issues to the states. Since the federal government is mostly charged with defense and the free flow of trade through the states, most societal and economic issues are left to the states in actuality. Justice John Marshall describes our state powers as follows: the immense mass of legislation which embraces everything within the territory of the United States, not surrendered to the general government, all which can be most advantageously exercised by the states themselves. In summary, Justice Marshall explained further afterward that the states receive much power by not explicitly being granted power by the federal government. Another reason for the importance of federalism is federalism makes regulatory diversity possible, meaning policy diversity is increased. There are numerous instances where states can be defined as individual testing entities for the larger federal government. New and improving societal and economic policies continue to be produced and sometimes redacted throughout the states. As long as federal laws are applied and obeyed, states may well enact novel legislation. This can be done in plain view by the other states and implemented or ignored accordingly. Especially when it comes to economic policy, states may attract businesses based on positive outcomes from regulatory measures or a lack thereof. There is an argument for a disintegrating position of states in constantly trying to deregulate more than the competition. However, it is much more probable that a state legislature will enact proper regulatory measures to ease the transference of businesses to their state rather than letting them run rampant. The third reason of federal logic is that voting empowers the sovereign individual citizen. It is very much so to be impossible to sway an election with one vote by an individual, but characteristics of a federal government can improve competition in light of benefiting individual liberties. This is through the power of movement, and an individual can vote based on their transition to a new location. It is far more influential on an individual's life to experience differing policies by other locations firsthand rather than through electoral processes that take time and may never come to fruition. It can also be seen in relation to the so-called race to the bottom that this prevents such by providing the opportunity for individuals to move amongst the states. The importance of keeping social issues local is among the reasons for a federal system of government as well. Social policies are more often keen to the sense of preference of individuals over that of economic policy. This relates to movement extensively, and many individuals will see communities with a likeness to their social preferences. Diversities as such can only be accommodated by local government. The federal government prevents the states from imposing restrictions on such diversity. In all these ways, liberty is more robustly protected by confining lawmaking to the state and local levels in a federal system than moving all such decisions to the national level. And lastly, federalism avoids a political war of all against all, which is arguably the most important of all reasons for a federal governmental system. Many fight more fervently when they are trying to achieve their political goals, and the consequence of losing is detrimental to their prosperity. As controversy escalates to a federal level, the harshness of such increases drastically, and we get into a scenario that Thomas Hobbes, our guy, described as a war of all against all. So this is in my own words, but it comes from the Constitution Center, the information. The prevention of this lies in liberty being bestowed upon the individual. As described, individual liberty is more prosperous under a federal government than that of a state sovereign government. Supreme Court cases regarding federalism in the United States have always made a stir. The federal government is not allowed or supposed to be able to run rampant. Decisions made by the federal court in reference to the Commerce Clause attempt to put limits on something deemed without limit. In order to limit the federally enforced powers that be, the Roberts and Rehnquist courts have given to alternatives. They show where state sovereignty may begin by contrasting where the power of Congress ends. They designate power by using the gray or blank areas of the Constitution, and these courts have delineated federal power specifically. There are differences between external/sovereignty-based limits on congressional power and those derived internally. The limitations on federal power by providing for state sovereignty are basically wrong, but proponents argue that this legislation is more likely to persist because it provides a sense of manageability and the legislation is more legible. The court cannot bound the boundless, which is the case when federal power is defined in isolation. Without state sovereignty as a check on federal power, the court must undertake the difficult decisions of deciding where intrastate commerce can be regulated. For example, although a state sovereignty-based federalism provides for a more manageable congressional system, it is hardly the answer. This is because in the modern world, states and federalist systems are greatly intertwined and overlap accordingly. States are not self-governing entities, but rather administrative entities supporting the federal government. The court should, in its interpretation, make certain that they recognize a relaying relationship between the states and the federal government. Their current interpretation fails to capture and deeply integrate highly interactive relationships between the states and the federal government in so many regulatory arenas. The Articles of Confederation did very little to protect states from foreign invasion, as well as commercial warfare perpetuated by other states. States often would act on their own in this regard when they should have been collectively unified, and the founders easily identified this. The essential ability to reach any objective or goal for the nation required the raising of funds, but that was not possible under the Articles of Confederation. The national government was able to ask states for funding but could not mandate it. This severely undermined the nation and left it widely open to hostile eventualities. The importance of a unified authority with the ability to tax and raise funds is abundantly clear and includes the ability to regulate interstate and international commerce. The Taxing Clause provides Congress with the power to lay and collect taxes and to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Of course, the powerful abilities of Congress extend further than those outlined here and are prospective in nature. The Taxing Clause was extensively debated at the Constitutional Convention and the related discussions. Hamilton argued that the power to tax and spend by Congress did not have to extend to the implementation of other congressionally enumerated powers. Madison, on the other hand, argued that taxing and spending were limited to only those related to the enumerated powers of Congress. The Supreme Court has since sided with Hamilton, and thus Congress does not have to relate its use of the Taxing Clause to other enumerated constitutional powers. However, it is important to maintain that Congress's authority is limited. It is not able to provide provisions that infringe upon constitutionally protected individual rights. There is more disagreement, though, in relation to internal limits on the Taxing Clause and whether they can be implemented by the court system. The Supreme Court historically has argued that Congress cannot implement monetary provisions in regard to modifying the public's behavior, but recently they have ordained that if they raise revenue, then the monetary provisions are permissible. The Supreme Court case regarding health care and the Affordable Care Act diminished much of the former controversy over the Taxing Clause. In this case, the precedence of imposing taxes to modify behavior held that the individual mandate requiring individuals to obtain health insurance or be fined was adherent to the Taxing Clause. Thus, it has been established that although a payment may encourage or discourage certain behavior, it does not force an individual to adhere. The Taxing Clause was extremely instrumental in the main failures of the Articles of Confederation, the lack of collective action. It can be noted that many states were free riding off of other states that were upholding and funding the government at the time. It is also essential to note that although the colonists were strongly against taxation without representation, taxation with representation was essential. Therefore, the resulting Constitution gives Congress broad and powerful taxing abilities. Many progressive constitutionalists would argue that the Taxing Clause does not put any internal constitutional limits on Congress's taxing authority. Personally, to the view is the idea that redress for misuse is contained in the political processes of the public, and voters discouraged can vote officials out. Progressive constitutionalists are more prone to favor political safeguards over judicial safeguards and limiting congressional and federal power. The language of the taxing clause is best understood to have taxing power in congruence with the idea that raising revenue rather than regulating human behavior is a primary purpose of Congress. Also important is the fact that Congress would be able to bypass the limits imposed on the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court has held that the Commerce Clause allows Congress to impose penalties in order to regulate the economy as it relates to interstate commerce, but not for non-economic conduct. If there were no limits to the taxing clause and changing a penalty to a tax were permissible, then there would be no limits to penalization of non-economic activity. Therefore, the only obstacle is the distinction between a penalty and a tax for purposes of the federal tax power in relation to Congress's ability to modify behavior. Arguably, the ruling regarding the Affordable Care Act, in which the Supreme Court allowed a payment requirement for foregoing health insurance and considered it a tax, although it was labeled a penalty by Congress, is correct. There then exists an effects theory which justifies such. The purpose of a penalty is to completely diminish conduct, while the purpose of a tax is to dissuade conduct. There are three characteristics that differentiate a penalty from a tax. A penalty holds a wrongdoer condemned, the payment must be more than the gain, and the payment must be increased for repeated offenses. On the other hand, a tax continually allows the wrongdoer to persist in their behavior, the payment is less than the gain, and repeated instances do not raise the rate of payment. The Affordable Care Act, payment for not having health insurance is expressed as a penalty, but has the essential characteristics of a tax. Congress's intention regarding the payment determines the constitutionality of such in relation to the taxing clause. Since the payment will largely raise and consistently provide revenue, it should be considered a tax. Lacking the ability to tax will leave a government with few means or abilities to pursue anything substantial. The Constitution grants and provides a general outline for Congress to procure money from the states and entities of the United States. There's a lack of willingness to provide funds when other members of an entity are already doing so. There are limitations on the United States taxing power, first of which is the requirement that direct taxes require apportionment. Secondly, all duties, imposts, and excises must, albeit easily done, be uniform. Thirdly, bills for gathering revenue must come from the House of Representatives initially. And fourthly, as a result of the 16th Amendment, income taxes are only applicable to income coming from a source. In this situation, a taxpayer must experience an extension to wealth from an event such as a sale, exchange, or receipt. An increase in an entity's value is not necessarily considered taxable, but in some instances it is, such as in the case of a corporation's value. Though this is not considered a tax and is rather an excise that must be uniform. Fifthly, a multitude of limitations on power and individual rights are present in the Constitution. A tax cannot infringe on the Equal Protection Clause, but it has been held by the Supreme Court not to be restricted by the Due Process Clause. There are several implications to this result involving several of the amendments. Sixthly, taxes are typically intended to promote the general welfare. And finally, the limitations on taxing power are largely unclear. Even after many years since the ratification of the Constitution, there are arguably two tax categories, direct and indirect. Direct taxes are required to be apportioned, while indirect taxes are required to be uniform. The Constitution does not use language to specify this and leaves out the term indirect, which in the scenario describes duties, imposts, and excises. Therefore, whether another unspecified type of a tax may exist is yet to be determined. Indirect taxes have not been limited as of yet by the Supreme Court to only include the aforementioned terms. Some may argue, however, that the payment encompassed within the Affordable Care Act is one such new type of tax, since the Supreme Court held that it indeed was a tax, but not a direct one. The requirement of having health insurance involves an activity rather than a lack of activity. Duties, imposts, and excises all involve the proceedings of an activity. Whether this payment for not having health insurance must be uniform is still not settled. In practice, there were 13 separate entities governing the United States before the implementation of the Constitution. In these states, the typical form of government saw the legislature as vastly more powerful than either the executive or the judiciary. Okay, so the credit market began to be upheaved by many legislatures, relieving debtors and foregoing the rights of creditors. There was also an abundance of laws imposing trade barriers between states in order to protect lawmakers, businesses, and interests. And finally, since the individual legislatures were in control of state commerce, trade agreements with foreign nations to export American goods were severely limited. The resulting economic downfall was the responsibility of the democratically elected legislatures, and the Constitutional Convention was called for. The Contracts Clause fixed the debtor-creditor problem by disallowing states from impeding the impact of contracts. The Commerce Clause, though, reconciled the power to implement trade agreements by granting Congress the ability to maintain commerce between the United States and foreign entities, as well as among the states, removing the state legislatures from the interstate confrontations and imposing a large swath of trade powers through the President and Congress helped fix the longstanding economic downturn. It is also important to note that the international commerce powers given to Congress allowed for the abolition of the slave trade to and from the United States as of January 1st, 1808, which was the earliest it was allowed to be done by the Constitution. The three distinct powers relating to commerce and the Commerce Clause that limit Congress from infringing on a state's internal commerce powers did not provide for the ability to abolish slavery within the United States. There are three interpretational questions arising from the Commerce Clause. 1. The meaning of commerce. 2. The meaning of among the several states. And 3. The meaning of to regulate. Commerce meant the activity of selling, trading, and exchanging and transporting goods and people, as distinct from producing things being moved. To regulate meant to make regular, but at least with respect to international trade, it also included the power to ban the trade in some cases, as Congress banned the slave trade among the several states meant between one state and others not within a state where slavery existed as an economic activity. Since the founding, the meaning of commerce has lacked alteration. One exception is the expanded understanding to consider insurance as a form of commerce. Modern expansions of regulatory powers by Congress have been permissible by the courts, which have considered the necessary and proper clause broadly, thus giving Congress the ability to mandate intrastate economic activity with an effect on interstate commerce, but only when regulation is needed for the regulation of interstate commerce. The Supreme Court, during the New Deal, stated that the power of Congress over interstate commerce is not confined to the regulation of commerce among the states, and though manufacturing is not interstate commerce, the transportation of such is, and the prohibition of which would fall under congressional powers. This power extends to those activities intrastate which so affect interstate commerce, or the exercise of the power of Congress over it, as to make regulation of them appropriate means to the attainment of legitimate and the exercise to a legitimate to the attainment of a legitimate end. The exercise of the granted power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce, as stated by the Supreme Court. Okay. There have been many back and forth decisions made from the Supreme Court since the New Deal, essentially resulting in expanded congressional power over interstate commerce and furthermore the national economy, at least for a while. Then in the 1990s, it was determined that the interpretation given by the Supreme Court during the New Deal was the extent of congressional regulatory authority in relation to interstate economic activity. It was decided during the debate surrounding the Affordable Care Act that the penalty for not having health insurance went beyond the powers granted through the Commerce Clause, but was not coercive enough to still be considered a tax. In summary, the Commerce Clause can be broadly read to include power over all economic activity and cannot be resolved amongst the states, while a narrow reading would allow specificity in the implementation of the enumerated powers by the Constitution, and the broadest of understandings would extend to instances beyond the comprehension of the Founding Fathers. Article 1, Section 9. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion and invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels be bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties on another. No money shall be drawn from the treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state. So, Article 1, Section 9 contains the Appropriations Clause, which states that Congress is vested with the power of the purse. Finances must be legislatively apportioned before funds can be dispersed. The following relates to appropriations and constitutional separation of powers. This is not a legislative grant of power because the necessary and proper clause of the previous section specifies that Congress can set the objects, amounts, and timing of federal spending. However, it is possible for Congress to set limits on executive spending, and without such limits, the executive branch would be enabled to raise revenue and spend at its discretion. The executive branch would be enabled to raise revenue and spend at its discretion. The Appropriations Clause. So the Appropriations Clause, in contrast, designates Congress with the responsibility of checking federal government fiscal spending. This power of the purse is central to a separation of powers. Prevented by the Constitution is spending without congressional approval by the President or the executive agencies and departments. There is one extremely rare circumstance in which the President can bypass legislative approval and make financial decisions in an emergency without appropriation. Besides this, Congress is obligated to present financial access to the President for federal spending. If Congress decidedly rejects provisions of finances to the President, that so empowered office would be left for naught. There is scholarly controversy concerning this legislative authority to withhold financial support from the executive branch. It would seem that Congress may not interfere with the execution of laws or judicial branch procedures and must therefore provide the funding necessary. The federal court has never been put into a position where it would be compelled to force the transference of funds from the legislature to the executive. Contrary to this, though, it has been ruled that Congress may compel funding related to state governments and force the president to spend. The following relates to appropriations: limit on amount, object, and duration. Appropriation is more than just a designation of a number of monies to be spent. It includes the requirement of specifying where the funds are going and on what activities they will be spent on. Although there are acts passed that authorize federal agencies to fulfill certain duties, this does not necessarily include appropriations of finances. Congress has considered this object to include that appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law. This relates to the federal agency's ability to reprogram small portions of appropriations to better fix their needs. The following relates to backdoor spending. There are alternatives to federal spending besides mandated statutes that are also considered appropriations. This includes Congress's authorization to obligate funds that have not yet been appropriated. These funds are not spent, however, until appropriation has been made. Another scenario in backdoor spending involves congressional spending that is indefinitely authorized to federal agencies. Such includes spending on the national debt, entitlement programs, certain subsidies, and more. Appropriations are made at the creation of such programs, and they are typically limited by object and not by the amount or duration of payment. There have been times when Congress has been limited by amount and duration, but not object. In this case, the structural foundation of the Appropriations Clause arguably may not be enforced. An example of this is appropriations made for national defense and intelligence, which do not always have a legible dissemination of funds within themselves. Another controversial form of spending relates to donations and gifts, which are not always well described by the institution which were appropriated funds. The Federal Home Loan Banks are another example of operations that persist outside the constraints of the Appropriations Clause. There are a number of other examples. Until 2010, the Federal Reserve was the only legally accepted agency to operate outside of the Appropriations Clause, but now the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does that as well. The following relates to the Statement and Accounts Clause included in Section 9 and accompanying the Appropriations Clause. It is written in a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. This is a duty for the legislature in which they must provide descriptions of all funding. However, Congress has failed to divulge spending specific to things such as backdoor federal spending programs, federal insurance liabilities, and spending and borrowing by semi-autonomous federal entities. Plus, other examples are present in the United States government. The Appropriations Clause and the Statement of Accounts Clause are not subject to direct enforcement by the executive, nor judicial rule, and are largely left to the discretion of Congress. On to Article 1, Section 10. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque, and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except that may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in times of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded, or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Okay, so the last section of Article 1 contains an extensive list of preventions and prohibitions set out in the Constitution relating to federal power. It is also very much related to state sovereignty as it prohibits the federal government certain powers. Section 10 also prohibits certain powers from being delegated to the states. Clause 1 of Section 10 lists prohibitions that Congress cannot forego, while Clauses 2 and 3 have the possibility of being foregone. It is not immediately clear why the first clause can be bypassed by legislation while the second two cannot, but both deal with the subordination of the state government to that of the federal government. The clauses in prohibition set out in Section 10 are divisible into several categories. One of these puts restrictions on the states, just as it does on Congress. These include the power to pass bills of attainder or ex post facto laws or grant titles of nobility. Another possesses the idea that the national government maintains the sole role of diplomacy and war making. Further encompassed is the fact that states are not subject to foreign interference. Also, another category is related to the ability to print money and other financial duties. States had subverted the national government during the Revolutionary War to issue credit to private entities without proper taxation in place. This greatly depreciated those appliances of credit. This led to the Founding Fathers having a large intention of giving these responsibilities solely to Congress. The resulting legal text in the Constitution largely describes the states as not being able to issue credit, but still allows for the borrowing of money. Silver and gold became the only legal tender for this, and states were not able to disperse letters of credit. A final category utilizes the states as a whole in dealing with foreign and domestic affairs. There is controversy relating to how states may not enter into a treaty or other agreement with the states or foreign powers without Congress's consent. States in imminent danger are, however, allowed to declare war. The nuances of all these provisions are not readily available in the Constitution, but are prescribed within regardless. The most controversial clause in Section 10 is the Contracts Clause, which states no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contract. This clause was also upheld to include contracts between the states themselves, and the clause applies to all contracts, not just those pertaining to credits and debits. In addition, the Contracts Clause protects both sides of a contract, not just the originator or subordinate. However, contracts made after legislative action invalidating a contract are not protected. There are also exceptions to cases involving policing and other judicially and legislatively related actions. This section continues to impose meaningful restrictions on major programs from mortgage moratoria to pension plan solvency, from bankruptcy reform to government lending practices. There is a major debate regarding Section 10 pertaining to the classical liberal view of the Constitution and contrasting a progressive view. Much of the Founding Fathers' intentions rested on the idea purported by former philosophers, and many institutions within the Constitution are based on protecting natural rights. This involves living in a perpetual state of nature and the protections needed in association with such. The Constitution does not provide a pass out of the state of nature, but instead the individual states are meant to do this. And contrary to this, and in relation to doing so, the Constitution provides for a complicated co-equal existence of the states. Specific provisions of Article 1, Section 10 are meant to protect certain individual rights. A large portion of this section does so by preventing above average treatment toward particular entities and by imposing punishments retroactively. Many of the prohibitions listed in Article 1, Section 10 are arguably not necessary and were found by the Founding Fathers to be instinctive of natural rights. A lot of Section 10 has not been the focus of litigation relating to the Constitution, but the Contracts Clause is another issue. It is part limited by judicial ruling and part natural right. One common reasoning for why the Contracts Clause was incorporated into the Constitution is because they were intending to protect interstate contracts and therefore commerce from federal scrutiny. This does not carry on toward local and individual contracts. In principle, though, James Madison declared that it was not the duty and irresponsible of states to interfere in individuals' affairs of business. One issue is that historically, in relation to legalities, it refuses to give credit to statutes of limitations, recordation statutes, and the statute of frauds. It is therefore important to compare the Contracts Clause with that of the Takings Clause of the Fifth Amendment. Why not read a just compensation exception in the Contracts Clause? And there have been Supreme Court cases making these clauses more relevant in practice. Arguably, a just compensation provision should be included in the Contracts Clause. Some contracts are also formed under dubious terms and therefore require further protection. Police power is something that should be addressed in this clause as well. There has been an elevation and turn to the interpretive challenge of how to identify what forms of regulation survive the literal application of the Contracts Clause beyond the obvious cases of gunpowder, policing, and other potential nuisances. This is where classical, liberal, and progressive views begin to be identified and contrasted here and throughout the principles presented in Article 1, Section 10. There are many clauses and provisions substantiated by Article 1, Section 10. The limitation therein prescribed by the Constitution does nothing to subjugate states to anything resembling sovereignty, and the word sovereignty itself is absent in the Constitution. Sovereignty is traditionally designated by the ability to wage war and diplomacy with foreign entities, but both are denied in this section of the Constitution. And the further dereliction of legislative powers regarding states has increased their lack of sovereignty as well as in a traditional sense. James Madison never achieved implementation of a provision in the Constitution that would give Congress the ability to veto legislation of the states, but the practice was implemented in alternative methods. The major point is that state sovereignty was never delegated, and rather the use of the word sovereignty is not included in the Constitution as previously addressed. So all this comes from the National Constitution Center. What I'm going to do is, and it's in my own words, I have quotes in here that you guys can't see. So if you were to work for the National Constitution Center, you would know some of this comes from the writers of the essays, but 98% of it's in my own words. There's barely anything that's in quotes. But what is in quotes, I will give credit to those who said it, and also the Constitution is also outlined by the national government. The National Constitution Center is a private organization, and technically you're not supposed to add or change any of the essays that they have on there. I wrote it in my own words. They can't stop me from taking information from their website and using it as long as I give credit to where I got it from. And I don't even really have to do that when writing a book. But I am going to give credit, and I am going to change it quite a bit and add a lot more from the federal government's website on the Constitution, and do my own constitutional research. That should take care of that. Next, we do the president. That was all of that was on Congress. And the Article 1 creates the legislative branch. That was the legislative branch, and that was Congress.